When we think of tank battles in World War II, one name always stands out: Prokhorovka. It wasn't just a clash of machines. It was the moment steel, fire, and desperation collided on an unimaginable scale. On July 12, 1943, the rolling fields near the small Soviet town of Prokhorovka became the stage for one of the most brutal armored encounters in history. The Germans had brought their fearsome Tigers and Panthers, advanced war machines designed to crush anything in their path. But waiting for them were hundreds of Soviet T-34s. Simple, rugged tanks that weren't as powerful but were fast, reliable, and everywhere. It was David versus Goliath, multiplied by thousands, and the result was chaos so intense that survivors described it as hell on earth. Imagine it: nearly 800 Soviet tanks charging forward against an elite Waffen SS armored corps, dust and smoke swallowing the landscape. The Soviets weren't trying to win a clean duel. They wanted to overwhelm the Germans with sheer numbers and courage. What followed was a storm of explosions, burning metal, and desperate close-range fights where victory wasn't guaranteed for either side. For the Red Army, this was a do-or-die moment. If they failed, Kursk could collapse. If they held, the tide of war might finally turn. And so began the Hell of Prokhorovka, when Tigers met T-34s, and the Eastern Front became a furnace of fire and steel. The summer of 1943 was tense. Hitler had planned Operation Citadel, a massive offensive to crush the Soviet bulge at Kursk. This wasn't just another battle. It was his chance to regain the initiative after defeats at Moscow and Stalingrad. For the Germans, Kursk was about pride and survival. For the Soviets, it was about proving they could stand toe-to-toe with the Wehrmacht. The Germans assembled their best units: the Waffen SS divisions, Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, backed by the newest tanks. The Soviets, however, knew the attack was coming. Their spies and intelligence networks had warned them weeks before. Instead of being surprised, Stalin and his generals dug in, creating layers of defenses stretching for miles. Mines, trenches, anti-tank guns, every inch of ground around Kursk was prepared to bleed the Germans dry. When the German offensive began in early July, it was like two tidal waves colliding. The Waffen SS pushed hard, their Tigers tearing through Soviet lines, their discipline and firepower unmatched. But the deeper they pushed, the stronger the resistance became. Soviet forces were waiting, layer after layer, ready to counterattack. Prokhorovka became the critical point. Both sides poured everything they had into that stretch of land. The Soviets massed the 5th Guards Tank Army, commanded by General Rotmistrov, with over 800 tanks. Facing them were fewer German tanks, but among them were the dreaded Tigers, nearly invincible at long range. On paper, the Germans should have had the edge. Their tanks were technologically superior, their crews highly trained. But war isn't just fought on paper, it's chaos, luck, and willpower. The Soviets knew their T-34s couldn't match the Tigers in open duels. So they planned to close the distance fast, turning the battle into a knife fight. It was risky, but it was their best chance. A close fight would neutralize the Germans' range advantage. And so, on the morning of July 12th, the stage was set for a clash that would shake the earth itself. Soldiers on both sides later admitted they had never seen anything like it. The scale, the fury, the sheer madness of what was coming. At Prokhorovka, the Eastern Front became a cauldron of steel, fire, and human determination. Dawn broke on July 12, 1943, with thick dust hanging over the fields. Soviet tank engines roared, their crews ready for one of the bloodiest assaults of the war. At 8:30 a.m., the 5th Guards Tank Army surged forward. Hundreds of T-34s advanced in waves, their tracks grinding the earth into smoke and mud. The German Tigers spotted them first. At long range, their cannons thundered, turning advancing T-34s into fireballs. But the Soviets didn't slow. Their orders were clear: get in close, overwhelm the Germans, and don't stop. The battlefield quickly dissolved into chaos. Dozens of burning tanks littered the fields within minutes. German tank crews fired as fast as they could reload, their superior optics picking out targets with deadly precision. But the Soviets pressed harder. For every T-34 destroyed, more surged forward, closing the gap meter by meter. Soon, the fighting was at point-blank range. Tanks crashed through each other's lines, firing at silhouettes barely visible in the smoke. At such close quarters, even the mighty Tiger lost its advantage. Soviet crews rammed their tanks into German armor, trying to disable them. Eyewitnesses recalled scenes of absolute madness, steel beasts colliding, flames erupting, and the earth trembling under the weight of war. Some T-34s drove straight into German lines, sacrificing themselves just to create openings for others. German commanders were stunned by the sheer recklessness and bravery of the Soviet charges. The air filled with smoke so thick that crews often fired blindly, aiming at muzzle flashes instead of clear targets. Planes screamed overhead, dropping bombs and strafing, adding to the carnage below. The battlefield became a furnace. Dust, fire, smoke, and screams mixed into a scene survivors later called pure hell. By midday, wreckage littered the fields. Burning tanks turned the landscape into a graveyard of steel. Neither side could claim clean victory. The Germans destroyed hundreds of Soviet tanks, but at the cost of their own momentum. The Soviets paid a terrible price in men and machines, yet they achieved their goal, halting the German advance. One German officer admitted it felt less like a battle and more like an endless wave smashing against a wall. Soviet soldiers, many barely trained, fought with desperation, knowing the fate of Kursk hung on their shoulders. Some crews fired their last shells and then continued the fight with machine guns or even by ramming. The close-range fighting erased the German advantage in technology. Suddenly, it was about survival, not superiority. Rotmistrov, the Soviet commander, later admitted he ordered all-out sacrifice. He knew the losses would be horrific, but retreat was not an option. German SS divisions fought ferociously, but every meter gained was paid for in blood. The Soviet tactic worked: overwhelm, close in, deny the enemy space to maneuver. By late afternoon, the battlefield looked like a smoking wasteland. Over 1,000 tanks had clashed in just a few square miles. Survivors described tanks burning so hot that ammunition exploded, sending turrets flying through the air. Some soldiers crawled from wrecked tanks only to be caught in crossfire, trapped in a no-man's land of fire and steel. Despite massive Soviet losses, the German advance slowed, then stalled. The SS divisions could no longer push forward. Their tanks were battered, their fuel low, their men exhausted. The Soviets, though devastated, still had reinforcements pouring in. It was enough to hold the line. By evening, both sides were spent. The fighting died down, leaving silence broken only by burning wrecks. Neither side could claim triumph that night. But in truth, the Soviets had won a strategic victory by stopping the German spearhead. The Germans had expected to crush the Red Army in one blow. Instead, they found themselves bleeding strength they couldn't replace. For the Soviets, Prokhorovka was a Pyrrhic victory. Thousands dead, hundreds of tanks destroyed, but the front still held. One Soviet veteran later said, "We didn't defeat them with skill. We defeated them with courage and sacrifice." German veterans, too, remembered Prokhorovka not as a victory, but as a nightmare where they fought endless waves of tanks. It became one of the most chaotic armored clashes in history, unmatched in scale and ferocity. And though the ground was soaked in loss, the tide of war began to shift that day. Because after Prokhorovka, the Germans would never again mount a major offensive on the Eastern Front. When the smoke cleared, the fields around Prokhorovka were littered with burning wrecks, Soviet T-34s and German Tigers alike. The Red Army had lost staggering numbers of tanks, but they had achieved what mattered most: stopping the German advance. The Waffen SS, battered and depleted, could not push further. Their dream of breaking the Kursk defenses ended in exhaustion. In sheer numbers, the Soviets suffered more, but strategically, it was the Germans who had been dealt the fatal blow. because unlike the Soviets, the Germans couldn't easily replace their losses. Every destroyed Tiger was a disaster. Soviet factories, relocated deep in the east, kept producing T-34s by the hundreds, month after month. By contrast, German production couldn't keep up. Their advanced tanks took too long to build, and too many were lost. The Battle of Kursk and Prokhorovka in particular marked the end of German offensive power on the Eastern Front. From this point forward, the Wehrmacht fought defensively, reacting to Soviet advances instead of driving them. For Hitler, it was a humiliation. His gamble at Kursk had failed, just as Barbarossa and Stalingrad had before. For the Soviets, it was proof that the Red Army could not only survive, but also turn the tide of war. The sacrifices at Prokhorovka became a symbol of determination, a story told for generations. Many veterans remembered the clash as pure madness. Tank against tank. Men fighting at point-blank range in burning steel coffins. It was less about tactics and more about willpower. Who would break first? And in the end, it was the Germans. Some historians argue that the Soviet losses were too high to call it a clean victory. But strategically, the Germans lost their last chance at seizing the initiative, and that mattered more than the numbers. The Eastern Front had turned against them for good. From Prokhorovka onward, the Soviets pushed westward, slowly at first, then with growing strength. Cities like Kharkov, Kiev, and eventually Berlin lay ahead. The Red Army was unstoppable now. The Germans, meanwhile, were trapped in a war of attrition they could never win. Prokhorovka became one of the defining battles of the war, not because of who lost more tanks, but because of what it represented. It was the clash where brute force and sacrifice overcame superior technology. It showed that even the feared Waffen SS could be stopped, bled, and forced back. For many, the image of T-34s ramming into Tigers symbolized the sheer desperation and determination of the Red Army. The battlefield itself became hallowed ground, a place of both tragedy and triumph. Today, Prokhorovka is remembered as the largest tank battle in history, though historians still debate the exact numbers. What no one debates is its significance. It broke the back of German offensive power and gave the Soviets momentum they never lost. It was, in many ways, the true turning point on the Eastern Front after Stalingrad. When Tigers met T-34s, history shifted. The price was horrific, but the result reshaped the course of the war. Looking back, Prokhorovka stands as a reminder of courage, sacrifice, and the brutal reality of armored warfare. And that is why it is still remembered as the Hell of Prokhorovka, the day the fields of Kursk burned with fire and steel.